In October 1347, a fleet of merchant ships sailed into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. They were returning from trade routes along the Black Sea, arriving at a bustling port that served as a gateway to the rest of Europe. When harbor officials boarded the vessels, they found most of the sailors already dead. Those few still clinging to life were gripped by high fevers and covered in strange, dark swellings that seeped blood and pus. Authorities struggled to name the killer. They looked for signs of a celestial curse or a corruption of the sea air itself, but they could find no physical explanation for why a crew would perish so quickly. Messina's officials immediately ordered the fleet back out to sea, but the quarantine came too late. The unseen cause of the deaths had already left the ships and entered the city. To find the source of the outbreak, we have to look thousands of miles away, at the Silk Road. The disease likely originated in Central Asia, hitching a ride on the merchant caravans and grain shipments moving toward the Mediterranean. These shipments were the primary habitat for the black rat. These rodents had lived alongside human agriculture for centuries, nesting in the holds of ships and the storehouses of every major trading port. The rats carried fleas that fed on their blood. When a rat died from the infection, these fleas would seek out a new host, frequently jumping to the humans who handled the cargo. The bacteria living inside those fleas, Yersinia pestis, was the actual killer. This bacteria attacked the body in 3 specific ways. The most common form caused painful, egg-sized swellings in the lymph nodes, called buboes. If the bacteria reached the lungs, it became an airborne infection spread through coughing. In its rarest form, it entered the bloodstream directly, killing within 24 hours. Without modern antibiotics, the results were devastating. The mortality rate ranged between 30 and 90%. The trade routes that brought Europe its spices and silks provided the exact path the bacteria needed to reach the continent's largest population centers. No one in the 14th century understood the mechanics of infection. Medical knowledge was based on ancient texts that provided no tools for identifying a microscopic threat. Doctors focused on the theory of miasma, believing the plague was caused by pockets of poisonous air rising from swamps or decaying organic matter. Others looked to the stars, claiming the alignment of the planets had corrupted the earth, or interpreted the suffering as a sign of divine anger. In many cities, this confusion turned into violence. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells to spread the sickness, leading to brutal massacres and the destruction of entire neighborhoods. While human authorities focused on these imaginary threats, the real biological cycle of rats and fleas continued to move through the streets entirely unhindered. Merchant networks in Venice and Genoa became the disease's primary delivery system. Ships unknowingly carrying infected cargo brought the plague to Italy's major ports by early 1348. From the coast, the bacteria moved inland along rivers and roads. It spread through France and Spain, eventually reaching the shores of England by the middle of 1348. The disease ignored social status. It killed farm laborers in the fields and members of the nobility inside their gated estates with the same speed. However, the highest death tolls occurred in cities. Overcrowded housing and poor sanitation allowed rat populations to thrive, placing humans in constant contact with the infected fleas. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio recorded the arrival of the plague in Florence. He described a world where people who appeared healthy at breakfast were dead before they could eat dinner with their ancestors. As the death toll rose, social order began to dissolve. Fear of infection became so great that parents abandoned their children, and the dead were often left in the streets because there were no longer enough healthy survivors to bury them. By the time the first wave of the plague finally subsided, the loss of life was so great that the existing labor systems and social hierarchies of Europe were forced to change. The continent had entered a different era. Imagine a wealthy Florentine merchant in 1348, hurriedly packing a wooden cart in the dead of night, desperate to flee to the countryside. Escape by sea offered no guarantee. Merchant ships were forced to anchor offshore for 40 days before docking, an early quarantine measure that left crews staring at a city they were forbidden to enter. These desperate retreats raise a question. How did Europe's wealthiest urban centers become mass graves? And when a crisis hits, which societal systems fail first? The danger began with the physical design of the cities themselves. Medieval streets were packed tight with homes and shops, relying on poor sanitation that often dumped waste directly into alleys, while grain warehouses attracted enormous numbers of rats. The people living in these dense quarters had no concept of germ theory. They had no way of knowing that a microscopic disease was moving from fleas to human hosts. Because of this density and lack of scientific understanding, these cities were architectural powder kegs. They provided the incoming plague with its perfect hunting ground. This chart represents Florence's population in 1348. Within a single year, the bar drops by up to 2/3. This rate of loss immediately overwhelmed the physical capacity of the city. At the height of the outbreak, accounts from Paris record as many as 800 people dying every single day. The pace of the disease was relentless. In London, maintaining individual graves and standard religious rites became impossible. Authorities were forced to dig massive pits on the outskirts of town just to keep pace with the dead. Before society could even coordinate a response, the volume of corpses broke the city's capacity to manage its own dead. The demographic collapse triggered an immediate economic freeze. This absence of leadership created a power vacuum. Without authorities to enforce laws, populations resorted to desperate measures, leading to widespread looting and violence. Beyond the loss of life, the plague paralyzed the basic mechanics required for society to function. The final institutional pillar to fall was the church. Priests were required to visit the sick and perform last rites, meaning their duties guaranteed repeated physical contact with the dying, leading to high mortality rates among the clergy. For a deeply religious society, the loss of these priests meant people were suddenly stripped of the personnel needed for a proper Christian burial. The ultimate medieval safety net, spiritual salvation, collapsed. Citizens were left feeling abandoned by both man and God. With governmental and religious safeguards failing, the collective human psyche snapped. The survivors were trapped in an inexplicable catastrophe. New, desperate groups emerged, like the flagellants. They traveled from town to town, believing that public physical pain was the only remaining method to appease God's wrath and stop the dying. This unchecked fear mutated into targeted violence. Mobs turned on scapegoats, leading to horrific massacres of Jewish communities based on baseless accusations of poisoning wells. When the institutions of reason and protection fail, terror fills the void with madness and violence. By 1350, as the first wave receded, Europe's great cities were left hollowed out, their populations cut down by half or more in just a few years. The physical structures were eventually repaired, but the old assumption that urban life was stable and predictable was gone. Those who remained lived with the memory of how quickly the world they depended on could dissolve. It's 1348. Inside a dimly lit home, a father hastily packs a bag. He glances back one last time at his infected wife and child, turns and walks out to save himself. He hammers iron nails through the doorframe from the outside, physically sealing his family into a tomb to ensure they cannot follow him. Fear on this scale overrides the drive to protect one's offspring. When these basic human obligations vanish, what remains to hold a community together? Between 1348 and 1350, the Black Death triggered a psychological apocalypse. The sheer speed of the infection meant that the normal rules of human behavior stopped applying almost overnight. This aerial photograph of an excavation shows the physical reality that broke the medieval mind. As graveyards overflowed, the dead were packed into massive communal trenches, side by side, in a relentless industrial-scale burial process. This level of loss did more than kill the population. It dissolved the unwritten rules of loyalty and kinship that had functioned as the foundation of European life for centuries. Medieval medicine had no answer for the symptoms. University-trained physicians relied on ancient theories about humors and bad air, treatments that proved completely useless against the biological reality of the plague. Physicians died at nearly the same rate as their patients. As the experts perished, the public's belief in formal medical authority vanished, leaving a population without a scientific framework to understand their own deaths. Ordinary people filled this vacuum with whatever they could find: folk remedies, superstitions, and increasingly desperate, often dangerous attempts at self-treatment. Without protection from the law or the church, human behavior splintered into two wild, desperate extremes. This medieval manuscript illustrates the first response: total hedonism. In cities like Florence, groups decided that if they were likely to die tomorrow, they should spend today in constant feasting and drinking. Their logic was a simple, nihilistic deduction. Since no amount of virtue or prayer seemed to stop the infection, they abandoned all social restraint in favor of immediate pleasure. While some chose the tavern, others turned toward extreme religious self-punishment, believing the plague was a direct punishment from God that required a blood sacrifice to stop. This fear gave rise to the flagellants. They moved between towns in ritualized public whipping processions, lashing themselves until they bled to atone for the sins of the world. These groups eventually began claiming they could forgive sins without the help of the clergy. This direct challenge to religious hierarchy forced the Pope to formally condemn the movement in 1349. But the terror didn't stay internal. As the plague continued, the need for someone to blame led to the darkest shift in the medieval psyche. In German-speaking territories, baseless conspiracy theories claimed that Jewish people were deliberately poisoning town wells to spread the disease. Pope Clement VI explicitly noted that Jewish communities were dying at the same rate as everyone else, proving they could not be responsible. Despite this, the panic was so absolute that it led to mass burnings and massacres in cities like Strasbourg and Basel. Unstoppable terror always looks for a target. In the middle of the plague, fear proved it could completely overwrite both the law of the state and the authority of the church. By 1350, the first wave receded. The survivors looked out at a world where every pillar of their lives, family, faith, and medicine, had buckled. The art of this period reveals the psychological damage. This fresco shows the danse macabre, the dance of death, appearing across the continent. Kings and popes are treated no differently than peasants, a reminder that the plague stripped away the illusion of status. This woodcut print reinforces the philosophy of memento mori, remember you must die. This wasn't just a religious slogan, it was a generational realization that the old social order was fragile and temporary. This cultural shift was backed by a brutal physical reality. In some regions, nearly half the population had vanished in under 3 years. The sheer number of deaths created a massive labor shortage. Fields were left unharvested, and manor houses sat empty because there were no longer enough people to perform the work. As the workforce population drops, the value of those who survived spikes. For the first time, peasants realized they could leave their lords to find better pay elsewhere, breaking the core economic tie that defined the feudal system. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed the trust required for the medieval world to function. Between the collapse of religious authority and the new economic leverage of the survivors, the rigid hierarchy of the Middle Ages simply began to fall apart. It is 1381, and England is facing an impossible standoff. Mud-spattered commoners, armed with farming tools and pitchforks, are marching aggressively against panicked armored nobility. How do illiterate laborers suddenly gain the leverage to dictate terms to the highest lords of the realm? To find out, we have to look back to the aftermath of a plague that had seemingly vanished decades earlier. Before 1350, European society functioned on this rigid model. It was a hierarchy that relied on a massive, cheap peasant population. The math was simple. There were always more workers than there was land to farm, which kept the power firmly in the hands of the landowning nobility. Then the Black Death arrived. In just a few years, roughly half of Europe's entire population vanished. This loss of life created an immediate vacuum of power. The demographic math that had sustained the medieval order for centuries no longer added up. The physical landscape told the story first. Thousands of estates sat overgrown because there was no one left to harvest the crops. This shift inverted the relationship between land and labor. Surviving peasants realized their work had a new value. Laborers began demanding higher wages, better conditions, and freedom to move. Desperate landowners were forced to compete for the remaining workers. The nobility tried to stop this shift with the law. In 1351, England passed the Statute of Laborers, a decree that tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and make it illegal for peasants to leave their local lord's land. But in reality, the law was completely unenforceable. The economic reality of unharvested fields meant that even the lords who helped pass the law were often breaking it to lure workers away. This legal attempt to claw back feudal control created a resentment that simmered for 30 years, eventually providing the spark for the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. While the rebellion itself was put down, the nobility's absolute control over the movement and cost of labor had been compromised in a way that couldn't be easily restored. The plague also challenged the cultural pillars of medieval life, starting with the Catholic Church. Before the 1340s, the Church was the undisputed source of protection and explanation for the world's events. When the plague arrived, the Church could neither explain nor stop it. Priests died in massive numbers alongside the people they were supposed to protect, demonstrating that no amount of piety offered immunity. Resentment grew when some clergy members began charging high fees for last rites at the peak of the crisis, leading many to see the institution as more interested in wealth than the souls of the dying. This breach of trust introduced a level of skepticism toward the Church's authority that persisted for decades, eventually providing a historical precedent for the theological challenges of the Protestant Reformation. Scholars and physicians faced a similar crisis. For centuries, they had relied on ancient medical texts that proved utterly useless against the disease. The catastrophic failure of traditional medicine forced a new generation of doctors to look away from ancient books and toward direct, careful observation of their patients. The inability of priests to save souls or physicians to heal bodies forced a society-wide shift toward questioning traditional institutions and seeking new answers outside of old authorities. By the early 15th century, the transformation was visible. The old, rigid pyramid had shifted into a more fluid network, where paid labor and social mobility were becoming the new norm. This new social fluidity and the widespread questioning of old certainties created the environment necessary for an intellectual and artistic explosion. The Renaissance, literally a rebirth, emerged in a Europe where the old social and economic structures had been disrupted, making room for new intellectual and artistic exploration. But we shouldn't view this modernization as a simple silver lining or a fair trade. Tens of millions of lives were lost, families were destroyed, and entire communities erased from history. The suffering of those years was an absolute tragedy that cannot be balanced out by its eventual consequences. The Black Death demonstrates how a catastrophic event can trigger long-term changes that were neither intended nor predictable. The plague killed a third of a continent, but it also dissolved the rigid systems of power that had restricted European life for centuries, allowing the foundations of a different social order to be laid in the aftermath.